This is our subway map, which you can download on our website at the URL at the bottom, and shows all the different vendors that we cover and what the different products that they do. And the light blue line is WCM. It's very much like digital asset management and others. It's a highly fragmented marketplace. You have dozens and dozens of choices. So, this is an important discussion. What's the right choice for you? And there's a lot of people who take different approaches to this. You may have heard of the Gartner Magic Quadrant, which it's kind of easy to criticize it. And of course, we're poking fun at it here. It was actually a quadrant like this that had me found CMS Watch in the first place back in 2001. I was working at a systems integration company, and we were trying to implement some of the tools that were in the upper right-hand quadrant. And that's one way that people pick, because they just say, well, we'll just pick the one in the upper right-hand quadrant. It actually turned out to be many of these tools actually didn't work very well. I was wondering, well, how is that? The implementation experience is very different from what I'm reading in these analyst reports. And so I thought there had to be a better way of telling the real story about what's actually going on with these tools. So we're going to have 4 or 5 lessons today, and the lesson number 1 is avoid these sort of static quadrants that tell you what's in the upper right. Usually those are more sort of mystical vendors with really good analyst relations as opposed to what's the right fit for you. The second lesson here is to really understand WCM in a broader digital engagement context. So this is particularly critical for 2018, because one of the interesting trends that we're seeing is not that WCM is less important, but that the scope of what we're asking WCM tools might be narrowing a little bit. And this is actually, I think, an opportunity for you. Because if we look at this in the broader digital marketing engagement reference model, and so this is a reference model that we've come up with and we use with our subscribers to help them understand their environment. You've got enterprise data at the very bottom, of course, and ideally some kind of a data backbone. But then in terms of content and engagement management, yeah, you've got WCM, very important, but then also digital and marketing asset management, marketing automation, social engagement, a variety of different marketing and delivery services off to these different channels. So the key thing here is that, your WCM platform has to kind of live in a broader content and engagement management universe. The WCM vendors will tell you that it should be the center of your universe. I'm not necessarily always keen that that's actually always true. And so the second lesson here is to make sure that you have the right scope for what you're trying to do, and not to ask the WCM platform to be doing things that maybe it shouldn't. And that could be even things like managing images, doing outbound marketing, serving as a portal, also being your e-commerce front end. These are things, particularly in a larger enterprise, that are probably best done by other tools. So how do you pick which is the right tool for you? And many organizations will look at this from kind of a feature perspective. And in our research, our WCM evaluation research, yeah, we look at these features as well: technology services, content services, experience services, and we look at things like multi-channel, structured content, page management, content reuse, of course, DevOps increasingly important, multi-site management, all these sorts of things. So features are important, but they're not decisive. You really don't want to be leaning on just doing feature analyses and feature checklists. And a lot of consultancies and analyst firms do this, and it's totally the wrong approach, because it doesn't tell you what's actually going to be the right fit for you. And in fact, many of these features you may not necessarily even need, or you may not even want from a WCM. What you really want to do is look at usage scenarios. So this is what we do in terms of use cases, and this is the key to all of the tools that we provide our subscribers into evaluating these vendors, is to look at, okay, here's 10 canonical types of digital properties or experiences we're trying to. This is looking at the OpenText, formerly Interval and Autonomy HP team site. What is it good at, right? And the reality is that no WCM vendor is going to be really good at more than 2 or 3 of these, because to be good at one often means that you're weaker at another. And so it's really finding the sweet spot. What does the vendor want to do well, and what is it not going to do so well that I may have to contort it and push it and basically kind of bastardize it to fit my use cases. So team site, not really good for some of the simpler scenarios. It's okay for mobile optimized experiences and a little bit in terms of content enriched applications, but otherwise it's not particularly strong at the other stuff. So this is one way to really start getting towards fit, which is what we do in our research, which is line up these canonical use cases and then evaluate what's the vendor's sweet spot against that. What I'm going to encourage you to do then going forward is to think about your own user journeys and what are your own use cases. So we'll circle back to that before the half hour is up. But the second lesson then learned today here is don't do feature analysis, do vendor usage fit. Then, of course, the other important thing to look at is the vendor and product intangibles or strategic considerations. The big one that we really focus a lot on in terms of our own research is the broader ecosystem. And so this is customer communities is a big one, services partners, potentially software partners, although they come and go. Certainly having some kind of a customer extranet is really critical. What's the vibrancy around this technology? We think that that's actually the best predictor of the long-term health of the tool, regardless of what happens to the vendor. And so, this is another area where we also evaluate the vendors, and you'll want to pay very close attention as well. Okay, so now let's look at the marketplace. So we're looking, okay, here's how you evaluate the vendors based on their sort of fit and some of the strategic considerations as you're narrowing down. But, if you look at particularly what's happening in the WCM marketplace is that many of the tools are becoming more platform-like. So there's this divide between platforms, which are richer and more customizable and certainly more extensible, but are going to be more developer-intensive. They're going to be more complex. They're going to be more developer-intensive, and they're going to cost more, as opposed to products, which tend to work very well out of the box, but may have limitations. They may be certain things that the product simply can't do. So, for example, very often many software as a service multi-tenant solutions are products, right? You can do what you can do with them. You can make some basic configurations, but if it doesn't do something, you're stuck. You can't make it do it. Whereas platforms mean never having to say no, just how much time, money, and ibuprofen is it going to take to turn this WCM platform into the right application for me. This is really important for you to understand where you're at on this spectrum. My wish for you is to always have simpler needs so that you can address them through products. But that's not always the case, particularly larger enterprises sometimes need these more developer-focused sort of platforms. And certainly the marketplace is responding. So this is how we evaluate the WCM marketplace, where you have platforms, complex platforms on the left, down to simpler products all the way on the right. This is, of course, a spectrum. We group them into these buckets here. It's a complexity spectrum. One thing that I would suggest, though, is that these legacy platforms at the bottom are pretty much disappearing, and generally speaking, you don't want to use those for WCM. We list them here because, again, there is an installed base. Some people still are using, SharePoint, God help them, for external WCM and Oracle and IBM. We typically don't see people actually procuring them fresh. But the point here, the broader point here, is that this is a complexity spectrum from really complex platforms to simple products. And one of the things that we see happening in 2018 is this notion of, now we call what used to be mid-range products, we're now calling lower-end platforms. And so the divide here between product and platform, and this red line, is that if you're going to get anything to the left of that line, you better have at least one in-house developer, ideally two that are trained on the platform. Whereas very often you can get away with, on the product side, not having a developer that is pretty much out of the box, and you take the initial install, you do some configurations, maybe go back to the vendor when you need help. But you really don't want to do anything to the left without a developer, helping you out, because you will need developers to deploy these sorts of tools. Okay, so that's another trend, is that these tools are becoming more developer intensive, which means, among other things, when we get later into the bake-off discussion, you really want to make sure that you have your own developers involved in helping to vet this technology. So I mentioned that there was this kind of upper tier, and in particular, what we're seeing is a lot of energy and enthusiasm around these enormously complex platforms, Adobe AEM, Sitecore, and Acquia's build of Drupal and all the additional modules that Acquia has built on top of Drupal. And so it's quite frequently we see one or more of these on people's WCM shortlist. I think that as we roll into 2018, though, there are some concerns about this. We recently, for our subscribers, had a private Smackdown discussion and webinar around this, which was really interesting. And we're finding that many of the customers of these platforms are actually finding them overkill, and that to the extent that they are very complicated to customize and extend, that sometimes they're actually slowing them down rather than speeding them up. So I think that, one of the things that we see in 2018 is maybe a sense that we should be looking at things that are somewhat simpler than these major alternatives, not just to go with them because they have street cred, but that possibly, that they may be more than you need, and that overbuying in this marketplace is actually worse than underbuying. So if you're looking at Adobe or Acquia or Sitecore, also make sure that you're looking at some of their simpler alternatives. Now, there were certain other vendors that weren't in the SmackDown, doesn't mean they're unimportant. So, for example, we have a question about SDL. SDL has its place in the WCM ecosystem. Historically, interesting product because it was decoupled, which means that it had separate management and delivery. Historically, its real claim to fame is in multi-site management, particularly for global operations, and that is still today where we would likely recommend it, at least being on a short list. But because that's somewhat of a narrow niche, you don't see SDL on people's short list as much, but it's still a viable candidate out there in the world. Okay, so the other trend that we're seeing is, of course, around cloud. I think nearly all of the new WCM deployments that we saw among major enterprises last year, with maybe one exception, were all ended up being deployed in cloud. But the interesting thing is that software as a service, multi-tenant software as a service, except at the very low end of the market, really hasn't taken over. I think what we're seeing more is PaaS and infrastructure as a service. So I'm basically taking something, traditional software, and I'm either putting it in my Amazon environment, or I'm turning to the vendor, which may be able to support it as platform as a service. So it's still largely single tenant, so I can customize it and do interesting things with it, but the vendor is actually managing the environment. One of the things about PaaS you need to be careful of, because we've seen among our subscribers, particularly in the WCM space, some real surprises here around just who gets to push what into production, who's responsible for what tier in the stack. Is the supplier really experienced at delivering a 24/7 service, or are they a software vendor, right? Those are two different things. The other thing you need to be very careful of is these kind of software as a service add-ons that some vendors build on top of their own PaaS environments, which can be highly proprietary, not really portable, and so that can lead to lock-in. And then maybe you already have an existing relationship with Microsoft or Google or Amazon, and maybe you can and should be placing your WCM package in that environment rather than something that's managed by the vendor. So you have a lot of choices here, but certainly infrastructure as a service, platform as a service is increasingly what we're seeing as the way to go in 2018. The other big trend that's been out there for several years and has really taken off in the last year, this whole notion of headless CMS. So this is the idea that you manage content behind the scenes and you don't have your CMS actually deliver the digital experience itself, that's done by some other application. This is architecturally very elegant. There are some key issues around this. One of the things that we're really advising in 2018 is this notion of head optional. So that, yeah, I can go headless and get content in applications, content in different channels, content to devices, but there's certain times when I want to maybe have a more intimate experience where I want marketers in control. And in particular, we need to understand things like, where is this content used? Can I still do previews and simulation? Can I syndicate more than just content, but actually syndicate the experience? So really what we're advising people on 2018 is to really focus on head optional. Unfortunately, the vendors aren't totally there as well as we'd like, but this is something we'll be monitoring closely over the year. Of course, the other huge trend right now, particularly with the advent of more artificial intelligence and the potential for machine learning, is this whole notion of personalization. It's still, however, true that personalization is discussed more than implemented. So my wish for you in 2018, to the extent that you're going to be aggressive around personalization, to make sure that you have sorted all this stuff out in advance. First, that you're sure that you can deal with performance, because personalization is the enemy of caching. That you're sure that your analytics strategy can adjust for this, because now you're probably going to be doing more component levels tracking. The biggest hurdle we see around personalization is the inability to have the right content strategy and to execute on that strategy in terms of content variation. So if you haven't addressed that, then don't even bother with personalization. And of course, there's a lot of other issues around visualization, impersonation, and simulation, really critical, particularly in compliant environments. And then you have to be constantly babysitting and tweaking it. Although increasingly here, we're seeing some AI and machine learning kind of helping with some of that, and so that's positive. I think the broader question around personalization is, should the WCM even be doing this? That many organizations now, are particularly larger enterprises, are thinking about putting these sorts of decision rules a little bit lower in their stack so that they can apply them not just to inbound marketing, but also outbound marketing. And so I think there's an open question about whether this is really an important attribute for your WCM package. And so again, that may push you towards something potentially a little bit more simpler. And as a general rule, simpler is better. Okay. So that still leaves open the question, what's the right match? And there's obviously a trail wisdom out there. We had a little bit of fun with Game of Thrones trying to, try to see which of these vendors had which persona. And of course, we can all joke about this. Different vendors do have different personalities. Software vendors tend to have very strong personalities. But ideally, you would go about this in a more methodical way. And so that's what we're going to talk about for the last 10 minutes that we have together, which is really applying design thinking to your technology selection. My colleague Jared and I wrote a book about this. You can find on Amazon, The Right Way to Select Technology, which really looks at this in terms of, how do we apply more kind of agile type concepts to this whole typically very waterfall approach to selecting technology. And so the key things here is to build a team, to make sure that you test properly, and then to iterate and adapt rather than having a very fixed process. And in particular, you want to iterate and adapt around user stories. So obviously you want to build an interdisciplinary selection team. You want systems people, designers, authors, editors, marketers, certainly developers. You want a project manager and a business team lead. So that's the person out in front. She's the business, not necessarily a sponsor, but a director who's going to ultimately help adjudicate on the decisions. And then you want to take an agile approach that's very iterative. So you start with a long short list. You can use our tools to help build that short list, and then send out an RFP, go through vendor demos based on an RFP, and bake off. Now, the key thing about this is that your RFP is not a traditional RFP that's got a bunch of feature requests, but is much more narrative. Now, of course, you can filter down. You can use our tools to filter down in terms of technology delivery models, certainly regions still manage, and ultimately get to a short list. And so that's then where you send out the RFP. It's interesting is that the different use cases can generate different shortlists. So this is using our custom shortlist builder. This is a portal example, but still it could apply for WCM, where I have one portal use case that has, Clone and LifeRay in the winner quadrant and SAP in the loser quadrant, but then I have a very different portal use case that has them reversed, with SAP in the winner quadrant and Clone and in the sort of loser column. And it was because I was trying to do different things with that portal. So I encourage you to certainly try out our real quadrant generator, and you can try it out online on our website. And it's very interesting. What it will show you is that there are different ways of creating the right shortlist based not on some generic analyst view of the world, but on what's really important to you. So when you get to that shortlist, now you put together the RFP. Don't do long Excel checklists. The vendors have seen them all. They can check all the boxes. It doesn't actually tell them what's important to you. What tells them what's important to you is by building actual narrative journeys. These can be customer journeys, editorial journeys, developer journeys. We very often do when we're building these for our subscribers. So one might be creating a new microsite, right? And there's an art and a science to this, but you definitely want to have personas and a description, and then an actual set of tasks as Ben goes on this journey along with his boss, Louise, in terms of building a new microsite, right? So this is what you have the vendor respond to in an RFP. This is what you have them show you in a vendor demo. And then ultimately, when we get to the bake-off, this is what you're actually going to try yourself. So this is the key thing. The most important takeaway that I want you to leave with here is never buy this technology without actually trying it yourself and trying it in a competitive way. So the key thing, the difference between a bake-off and a demo could be half a day, 1 day. A bake-off is typically 3 days to 2 weeks. You're actually trained to use the system, and you actually get hands-on in the system. So you have real scenarios, real content, real people, that's you, a real environment, and then it gives you a chance to also negotiate more. So this obviously is more resource intensive, but it absolutely prevents you from making the wrong choice. So you're basically test driving the software. Never, ever, ever buy technology without test driving it. If you want to learn more about the real strengths and weaknesses of the tools, you can you can go to realstorygroup.com and check out some free samples of our WCM research, where we evaluate 36 vendors against some fairly hard-hitting criteria. So again, if you have any questions, I invite you to put it into the control panel in your GoToWebinar control panel. And so while we're accumulating some of these questions here, Scott, you want to just sort of wrap up on the details?
Absolutely. Thanks, Tony. And again, thank you all for your time today. I certainly appreciate it. Hope you got some value out of what Tony had to say around selecting web content management technology. And we definitely invite you to, as Tony mentioned, go on our site, try out the Real Quadrant and real-time applications. There's also a tool called Real Score, where you can benchmark your effectiveness against your industry peers, and then use that as a way to measure and track your progress moving forward. So certainly take advantage of that on our site under the Tools tab. Around the research itself, you can download a sample from the WCM research and any of the other markets we cover. And if you're interested in learning more about the subscription options that are available, you can reference that on our Buy Now page. And certainly you can ask us questions here, explore@realstorygroup.com. Happy to answer those as you have them. And also, when the timing is right, show you a behind-the-scenes tour of what will be available to you as a Real Story Group subscriber. It does look like we have a couple questions. Tony, I'll let you take those.
Yeah, so Ryan's asking, is there an opportunity or white paper on running a POC with a CMS vendor? We don't have a white paper on it, but we do have a chapter in our book, so that's one way. And then there's a brief distillation of it in a blog post that's part of a running series on selecting technologies. So if you go to any of our selection blog posts on our website, you go to the blog list, and you'll see there's an index to all of them, and one of them is on top tips for running a POC. Arjit is saying, wish more people would follow this methodology. You and me both. It's amazing to me how old-fashioned even large enterprises are, and very rigid in the way that they select tools, that in a very, very non-human and non-agile way. And we're trying to lead the charge to change the way it's done. But Jesse's got a good question here. Sometimes we found that user stories can be a bit too abstract for real measurement. How do you connect the dots in user stories and actual functional requirements? So a couple things about that. I think that you can certainly build some measurements into your user stories, and we've certainly seen that in terms of, even identifying, time on task and that sort of thing. And certainly when you get to the point of actually doing POCs, you can actually start measuring things, right? Because you're hands-on. I think the other piece to this that we didn't talk about, Jesse, is that we do have in the RFPs that we build for our subscribers, we have a separate segment that's called Advanced Q&A. And that's where we ask a lot of technical questions and qualitative questions. The key thing, again, is it's not a checklist about what, but it's more narrative questions about how. Like, how do you support Azure? Not do you support, installation Azure, but how do you support running in Azure? And then you get a very different set of questions. And you can definitely get into some measurement issues there as well. So I'm not suggesting that user stories are the sum total of your RFP. They're certainly, we believe, the heart and soul, but you definitely need to supplement them with other questions. And that definitely gives you opportunities to deal with, more, quantitative things as well. So in large organizations, Arjit's asking again, with big silos marketing, how do you build user stories and bring consensus to the selection process? Well, you have to build a team first and get aligned around a team. And a lot of times what we'll do when someone has a very disparate team of people who didn't know each other, is we'll come in and do some educational workshops and other things to get people thinking about it, to get them aligned around terminology. And then, someone needs to take the lead on generating the actual user stories. We've certainly done that for some enterprises. There's other consultancies out there. And then making sure that those stories then can validate against everyone. And by the way, it's often good to have developer stories and designer stories because they're key actors in this as well. IT may be more interested in some of the other advanced Q&A that I discussed, and obviously you need to make sure that their concerns are addressed early, and then that then bodes well for them participating in a more cooperative way. So So I'm afraid we've run a few minutes over, but I really appreciate your engagement and participation. Encourage you to download the sample of our WCM research if you're on this journey. And if there's any way that we can help you make the right decisions, that's what we do. So please don't hesitate to reach out to Scott for more details. So for my colleague Scott Dill, this is Tony Byrne from Real Story Group saying thank you once again and signing out. See you next time. Bye now.